Hello, everyone. So, I want to give you a brief lesson on the state of the women's movement in Eastern Europe and the colonial world about 100 years, almost exactly 100 years after the world-changing meeting that occurred at Seneca Falls, New York, that we learned about during our trip 2 weeks ago. So, what you see pictured here is women in Belgrade, Yugoslavia in February of 1948, meeting together as the anti-fascist women's group of Yugoslavia. And they drafted a set of resolutions that I'm giving you to look at to answer a few additional questions for your one credit that you get for the trip. So uh, to jump to the contribution of women in Eastern Europe in particular and the colonial world more broadly, I want to just do a little uh, aside talking about traditional feminist theories. So, traditional feminist theories in the West, largely in the United States, see the first wave of feminism starting right here at Seneca Falls and culminating with women gaining the right to vote in 1920. So, it's often seen as a really exciting period to be alive, with many women taking pride in doing groundbreaking things like becoming lawyers, doctors, and even right here in Delhi, New York, starting a high school women's basketball team. And I actually was able to find a picture of that Delhi women's basketball team from 1920, which is pictured in the bottom left-hand corner. So this legal equality empowered many women in the decades after 1920 to feel that they could accomplish anything. Legal equality with limitations, of course. So when World War II came around, images of like the army, the Army's Women's Auxiliary Corps, pictured in the bottom center of this, my collage of photos here, where women would do really cool things like fly fighter and bomber planes to the front lines for use by male pilots, still inspired so many activists and so many people. Women in factories with the symbol of Rosie the Riveter, here's an actual Rosie the Riveter here in the bottom right-hand corner, seemed to show that women moving towards equality was not only good for women, it was good for men, it was good for the nation as a whole. So in the United States, then, something rather unfortunate happened after World War II. When men returned from war, they expected women to give up their factory jobs, to give them back to men. So rather than empowering women, the extraordinary circumstance of war really seemed like it was reifying more traditional senses of a woman's place in the kitchen or in the home. So in the decade of the 1950s, then, so many women across the United States and Europe and in the communist world felt the progress of the previous century slipping away. They had less access to education, less equal protection by the law, and as Betty Friedan, pictured in the bottom middle here, uh, would write in her 1960 book, Feminine Mystique, they felt imprisoned in a comfortable concentration camp with all the amenities of modern life, but none of the freedoms and dignity that came from being allowed to pursue life outside of the home or outside of the confines of, very traditionally imagined gender expectations. So Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, which I have pictured in the top left here, would ignite what's been called the second wave of feminism, when women were no longer looking for the vote, but looking to use the power that came with the vote to affect legislation in support of women's rights and to use their activism to bring about a cultural shift in support of women's dignity. So the fruits of this are that women today have laws protecting against things like domestic and spousal abuse. Gloria Steinem, in the top right hand, was pretty key in that. Um, they can have bank accounts and credit cards in their own names and have an expectation, maybe not a reality, of equal pay for equal work, among other things. That was key to Shirley Chisholm's presidential campaign. She's kind of in the middle. So various iterations of third, fourth, and other waves of feminisms have often been in reaction to what many see as the problems of this second wave, especially that it was more of an elitist movement for privileged white women. And in the US, women's movements since this reinvigoration of the 1960s have emphasized things as various as the rights of women who want to be stay-at-home mothers, the intersectionality of oppression of poor women of color, rights for lesbian and transgender women, and just since 2018 with the Me Too movement, an overwhelming reminder that the objectification, exploitation, and abuse of women remains mainstream and normalized, though just in the last 6 years, it seems some pretty tremendous steps have been taken in reaffirming that women's contributions at all levels of society, politics, and the economy actually make us stronger as a people. So putting that rather lengthy aside, I want to talk about communist women's movements. And they've only really been receiving serious academic attention over the last 20 years, realistically the last 10 years. For most of the last 80 years, communist women's movements have been seen by Western researchers as tools of the state rather than legitimate manifestations of actual efforts at women's empowerment. There's been a tendency in the West to kind of ignore things that happened in the Eastern Bloc as sort of staged and led by, a one-party state where people weren't allowed to think for themselves. So, and this sentiment of dismissing the women's movements in the Eastern Bloc has actually been joined by renegade women's movements from the Eastern Bloc, who, especially in the 1990s, often lamented that it was pretty hard to fight for women's rights in countries that had officially resolved the woman question. A new wave of women's rights activism, specifically in Yugoslavia, occurred after 1978 with a really powerful essay written by this researcher named Lidia Sklivitsky, and it was called More Horses Than Women. And what she did is she went through primary and secondary, K through 12 history textbooks about World War II in Croatia, one of the republics of Yugoslavia, and she counted the number of times that communist partisan men versus partisan women were mentioned. And what she was shocked to find was that obviously there were way more men than women, but actually there were way more horses mentioned than women. Usually the special friendly horses that certain men had, usually with little pictures and asides and sidebars. And so she wrote this essay basically saying more horses than women, to point out that even though 2 million women had actively served in the Anti-Fascist League during World War II, many of them bearing arms in partisan movements, they had essentially been erased out of Yugoslav history textbooks by the 1970s. So for decades, the communist women's activists of the 1940s and 50s have been dismissed both internationally and within places like the former Yugoslavia itself. And I think that's unfortunate. And I should say, I'm talking about the Eastern Bloc broadly, but really everything that I'm sharing with you comes from Yugoslavia, mostly the Republic of Slovenia. So in the developing world, though, so it ignores the contributions of these Yugoslav women on the developing world, on their own politics, and on the organs of the United Nations, especially the tremendous role that Yugoslav women played in bringing about the 1975 to 1985 UN Decade of Women. So the Anti-Fascist Women's League in particular was a largely independent movement, again, as I said, with almost 2 million members, that was incredibly effective during World War II at defeating the Nazi fascist occupiers, and after the war at influencing legislation in Yugoslavia, promoting literacy, organizing women for rebuilding the country, providing women's education on healthcare and contraceptives, as well as caring for the needs of millions of war orphans. They were so effective that they caught the ire of the higher Communist Party leadership, who officially disbanded the Anti-Fascist Women's League in 1952, arguing that a specifically women's organization undermined the unity that was supposed to be all Yugoslavs. This was part of the reality is that they were afraid of how powerful the women were becoming. So this was part of not only a Yugoslav, but a broader communist and global backlash against women's rights in the 1950s. So, it was no different in Yugoslavia. The Anti-Fascist Women's League of Yugoslavia was disbanded at about the same time that Rosie the Riveter was being forced back into the kitchen in the United States. So with that long bit of background information, I want to talk about a document that the Anti-Fascist Women's League produced in 1948, 100 years after 1848. And it's a set of resolutions on what their work was going to be for the upcoming 5-year plan, which is something that communist countries did. They always thought in terms of 5 years, always to build industrialization, socialism, usually completely unrealistic goals. But what I want you to do is I'm giving you a copy of these resolutions, and I want you to compare the ideas within this to the ideas of the Declaration of Sentiments, and specifically see if you can find something that may have influenced the Yugoslav women from the Declaration of Sentiments, which, spoiler alert, it absolutely did. All of the drafters of this document had been feminists since before they were communists, and absolutely read and were familiar with global documents on feminism, of which the Declaration of Sentiment the Declaration of Sentiments was absolutely, the first, the Magna Carta of these feminist movements. So um, I want you to see if there's anything within this document as well that I'm sharing with you that might indicate Communist Party control over and I'm using the acronym AFJ, Anti-Fascist Women League. It's the Serbo-Croatian writing. And little hint, there's a lot, like basically the first like 2 or 3 pages are mostly communist nonsense. But finally, I want you to see if you can find anything that goes beyond the Declaration of Sentiments in its advocacy for women's equality. In 1948, many communist women's activists in Yugoslavia sought to distinguish their moves for women's rights from what they considered to be bourgeoisie feminism, or feminism that didn't recognize the issues of class in women's empowerment. For Yugoslav women, the idea of a women's basketball team, for instance, would have been the height of fluffy nonsense. They were far too concerned with fighting against things like domestic abuse and fascist executioners to worry about the fineries of, athletic silliness. Uh, Not to mock those of you who play basketball, but the Yugoslavs would have mocked you. So as you answer these 3 short questions, I want you to think about 3 of the key women who helped to draft the above resolutions. We can consider them the Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the Lucretia Mott, and the Susan B. Anthony of Yugoslavia, though their stories are hardly congruent with those of the American women. So the Yugoslavs are Lidia Šinturić, Vida Tomšić, and Stana Gerc. So in my assessment, Šinturić was a communist tool who just went along with the party line, whatever it happened to be at the time. Tomšić, by contrast, was an incredible organizer and diplomat who managed to keep women's issues alive during the darkness of the 1950s, only to come back roaring in the freer atmosphere of 1960s and 1970s Yugoslavia. The third person, then, Gerc, was someone with literal killer instinct who had no patience for diplomacy. Yet, as a historian in the 1950s and 60s, she fought to have women rightly remembered for their role in bringing about Yugoslav liberation from Nazi fascism during World War II. All 3 of the women were present at this conference, and the first 2 women actually helped to write the resolutions you're reading. Gerc, just voted to approve them. So I'll start with Šinturić. So Lidia Šinturić, she was an old school communist from the Slovene Republic, capital of Ljubljana. She was university educated and had been active in communist cells since before the party was made illegal in the interwar kingdom of Yugoslavia. I should be clear, she was born in Austria-Hungary. So by the time of World War II, she was married to Sergej Krajger, who would become president of the Yugoslav Republic of Slovenia. Sergej and Lidia were both part of the initial declaration of resistance after Yugoslavia was occupied by the Germans in 1941. Both were part of what's called the Avnoj conferences in 1943 and 1944 that basically set up the infrastructure of a post-war socialist republic of Yugoslavia. So she was important. She was a mover and shaker. I have a picture of her, sitting with her fellow Politburo members, sitting right next to Marshal Tito, the big boss of Yugoslavia. So during World War II, Šinturić organized underground activities and grew in esteem among her peers so that in the post-war configuration, she was a member of the Central Committee of the Yugoslav Party in Belgrade. And for Šinturić, the Anti-Fascist Women's Front was always just a means to an end, a way to mobilize ignorant peasant women and give them socialist consciousness. And those were her terms, not for the sake of the women, but for the sake of the country, and more importantly, for the sake of the Communist Party. And while she helped craft the above declaration, this was among the last times that she would actually collaborate with Tomšić on women's issues. So long before 1952, when the Anti-Fascist Women's League was officially disbanded, Šinturić came to agree with the majority opinion that a separate women's organization had become infested with bourgeoisie sentimentality and undermined the class unity of the Yugoslav people. Šinturić would later become president of the Historical Commission of the Central Committee of the Yugoslav Party, and in this role, she fought vigorously against Stana Gerc's efforts to write a separate history of the women's organization. Vida Tomšić then had a very different trajectory to communist participation than Lidia Šinturić. So while Šinturić was an old communist, Tomšić, also from Ljubljana, spent the interwar years as a college student and housewife, and she did become active in the party in the late 1930s. She and her husband both became a lot more active in the communist-led liberation front of Slovenia after the Nazi invasion in 1941. Her husband was killed, while she spent almost 3 years in Italian concentration camps. And it was in the concentration camps that she first started building really serious networks of resistance. Tomšič felt like activists should make the most of their time in the camps, so she organized courses in Marxist-Leninist theory, taught people to read and write English, German, and Italian, and talked about women's rights all the time. The top left-hand corner is a picture of her with, many of the women that she had been interred with in Italian camps. So when Italy surrendered in 1943, Yugoslav women were released from the camps, and Tomšič by that time had quite the following among other detainees. She was quickly elected to a prominent position within the wartime socialist resistance government and would rise to be Prime Minister of the Slovene Republic after the war. For much of her post-war career, she had roles in the Central Committee of the Communist Party, and for a time she was president of the Anti-Fascist Women's League. So Tomšič was a fascinating person who used her knowledge of languages and other cultures to build massive global networks of women's activism. For years, she was the editor of a magazine called Nasza Žena, like Our Woman, that wrote about everyday concerns of infant care, child care, along with higher level things such as fighting against sexism and discrimination within the ranks of the party. Tomšič was a practical, flexible thinker who used dogmas when they suited her, but was always open to new ideas and always knew how to translate things into communist or into, more global languages. So I'm working on a project right now investigating the letters that she wrote to global women's leaders in 1948 to try and organize what was supposed to be the 1948 Women's International Democratic Federation Conference in Calcutta, India. Ultimately, the WIDF angered the newly independent government of Jawaharlal Nehru in India by encouraging rural Indian women to stand up for their rights. So under pressure from Britain and the United States, who objected to the fact that the Women's International Democratic Federation had communist leanings, the 1948 conference that was supposed to happen in Calcutta was canceled. It would instead be held in Budapest, though many of the activists that Tomšič got together for the Indian conference instead held one in January 1949 in Beijing. So ultimately, Tomšič's international and national activism became a threat to the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, so they worked to curtail her international activities and even shut down the Anti-Fascist Women's League. In response, Tomšič kept using what power she had to keep the Our Woman magazine alive and to push for women's rights inside Yugoslavia and for women's rights abroad, especially in the colonial world. It was her ties to African women and Indian women that were so crucial. So Tomšič played a key role in the 1948 drafting of the UN Declaration on Human Rights. In 1975, she also played such a key role in the UN's Women's Conference that she angered Western feminists. So at this conference, Betty Friedan was so annoyed by the love women from the global South had for Tomšič, which had been nurtured over decades of visits and correspondence, that she repeatedly referred to Tomšič as that communist bitch. Betty Friedan felt that as an American, she should be the one in charge of the conference. So the legacy of Tomšič is pretty incredible, and it's far more than a Yugoslav one. It's a global one. And, I can't say this for sure, but I assume that most of the parts of the 1948 resolutions that you're reading about women's and children's rights that, actually are substantive were written by Tomšič. The parts that seem very communist-y in tone were likely written by Šintjurc. So the final woman I want to talk about is Stana Gerg. So before World War II, Gerg, and her full name was Stanislava, was a kindergarten teacher in the rural Gorica region of Slovenia that's on the border with Italy. And so she became active in the Communist Party and excelled at underground work during the war. Her party work took her to Ljubljana in 1941, where she quickly rose to become head of the Security Information Service, the notorious VOS, and I'm using acronyms, as they're used in native languages rather than English. So it's the Varnostno Obveščevalna Služba, or Security Information Service, VOS. So it was here that she was involved in ultimately signing off on the execution of over 700 suspected collaborators. I should be clear too that she was a war criminal. People suspected of aiding the enemy would be tried in absentia, then have death sentences pronounced. which would often be delivered by kill squads who would knock on the people's doors, read the sentence, then shoot them over the threshold with a pistol. The population of Slovenia was 1 million in 1941, so 700 people were executed by the Communist Party. They had no defense. By 1943, the communists stopped using these tactics because they realized that so many people were driven to collaborate simply to resist communist brutality. So stopping these executions, it didn't help those who had already been murdered or their families. But after the war, Gerd, the executioner, or at least the person who signed off on these executions, she floundered. The previous two women rose through the ranks of the party. Gerd didn't. She got a job at the Institution for Revolutionary History in the 1950s, where she started to gather evidence for a women's history almanac of all of Yugoslavia during the war. Ultimately, her work in the Institute for Revolutionary History kind of ticked people off, especially Lydia Shinturz, who would shut her project down. And I have a series of letters, that I recorded between Shinturz and Gerd. And Gerd, she kept persisting. She eventually got fired from the Institute, but over the 1960s, as an independent researcher, she just kept putting this project together. And finally, in 1970, with support from her old friend Vida Tomšić, she got her over 700-page history published. And I have interesting archives of her cussing people out for not sending their contributions to the almanac in a timely manner. And ultimately, it's like her literal killer instinct. I shouldn't joke about that, but it helped her navigate the post-war patriarchal bureaucracy of Yugoslavia. And maybe her background as a kindergarten teacher too. I mean, I love my kindergarten teacher, but my wife had kind of a scary one. So within 2 years, the republics of Serbia and Bosnia and Macedonia would all publish similar histories to what Gerd had done for Yugoslavia as a whole. Finally, by the 1980s, it seemed that Yugoslavia was recognizing the unique role of women in World War II, or what they called their National Liberation War. And that's right when the more grassroots feminist movement of Sklivitsky emerged to question the seemingly stifling women's activism of their mother's generation. So this was coupled with widespread activism for women's rights, such as that of the Zagreb-based SOS line, which allowed women to report domestic abuse to people who actually cared, rather than the police, who usually would just ignore such calls. These same networks of women in the 1980s would organize for peace when the wars of the 1990s began to tear Yugoslavia apart. I have pictures of some of them up in the top left-hand corner. Today, many of them with much grayer hair, continue to research the legacy of an era when the women of the former Yugoslavia would work together for rights that transcend today's or yesterday's international borders. And just, some of the things I have pictured here on the top right is a women's activist choir in Ljubljana that, makes a point of singing partisan women marching songs from World War II as a symbol of empowerment. The bottom left hand, that lady has a sign that just says, "Feminism isn't a bad word." And then on the bottom right, you have the Transakcija Slovenia group, like trans action. We use that. Combination of words in the US too, and it's people fighting for trans rights and women's rights and LGBT rights more broadly in Ljubljana, who face, kind of an uphill battle in this, like so many people around the world do. So putting all of this together, I'm interested in your answers to my questions, which are attached to the same email that I'm attaching a link to this presentation. And I'm interested in what connections you can make between Dr. Brusso's questions and Seneca Falls in 1848 and Belgrade in 1948 and, probably Delhi, New York in 2024 as well. And it was great to be able to go on that trip with all of you. And I really like this, idea of having some academic engagement and college credit for what otherwise were just history club fun trips. It's like we can do fun and learn at the same time because learning is fun. So good working with all of you, and hope the rest of your semester goes well.